Hey guys, today we're going back to the Middle Ages through something so ordinary that it almost disappears from history. Mud. Not the dramatic mud of battlefields or sieges, but the everyday mud beneath people's feet. The mud that clung to shoes, swallowed cart wheels, ruined hems, slowed trade, shaped towns, and quietly made ordinary life far more uncomfortable than many modern images of medieval Europe suggest. Before we begin, let me know where you're watching from and what history topic you'd like to hear next. If you enjoy thoughtful long-form history, a like is a simple way to support this kind of work. And if you'd like more calm, quietly fascinating journeys into the past, you're very welcome to subscribe. So let's begin not with a king, or a castle, or a battle, but with the ground itself. Imagine stepping outside on a cold morning in a medieval village. The air is damp. Smoke from hearth fires hangs low over the roofs. Somewhere nearby, a pig is rooting beside a wall, chickens are scratching at straw, and a cart has already passed through the lane before sunrise, cutting two dark grooves into the earth. You place one foot down, and the ground gives way slightly beneath you. It is not a clean path. It is not even really a road in the modern sense. It is packed earth, broken by stones, churned by hooves, softened by rain, mixed with straw, dung, ash, spilled ale, rotting leaves, and whatever yesterday's traffic left behind. In dry weather it may harden into ruts. In winter it may freeze into awkward ridges. But after rain, which in much of northern and western Europe was no rare event, it becomes something more difficult. A surface that grips, stains, slows, and follows you indoors. To understand medieval life properly, we have to begin by taking such discomfort seriously. Modern viewers often imagine the Middle Ages through the great visible things that survived. Stone cathedrals, castles, manuscripts, helmets, carved tombs. But most medieval people lived much closer to mud than to marble. Their world was not built around smooth pavements, waterproof boots, reliable drainage, or sealed floors. It was a world where weather entered daily life with very little resistance. And this was not because medieval people were foolish or indifferent. That is one of the easiest mistakes to make. They understood mud perfectly well. They complained about bad roads, repaired causeways, laid stones where they could, used straw and brushwood, dug drainage ditches, and built raised walkways in some towns. But they lived within limits. Limited money, limited labor, limited materials, local obligations, seasonal pressures, and a landscape where the same road had to serve people, animals, carts, traders, pilgrims, tax collectors, messengers, and livestock. The result was a world where walking was rarely just walking. A short journey to the well could mean lifting your hem above the filth. A walk to church could leave your shoes soaked before the service began. A servant carrying water might need to watch every step, because a slip could spill the morning's work into the lane. A child sent on an errand might come back with feet so muddy that someone would shout before allowing them near the hearth. A peasant going to the fields might not think of this as hardship in the dramatic sense. It was simply the texture of the day. But that is exactly why it mattered. Mud was not an event. It was a condition. In many villages, the main track ran between houses, barns, gardens, and animal enclosures. It was walked by people in leather shoes, wooden pattens, bare or wrapped feet in some circumstances, and by animals whose hooves broke the surface again and again. Cattle passed through. Sheep were driven along it. Horses and oxen pulled carts whose wheels pressed deep into the softened ground. Every journey reshaped the road for the next person. There is a quiet irony here. Medieval roads were essential to society, but many of them were not maintained like the Roman roads people sometimes imagine. Some Roman routes did survive in places, and some remained useful for centuries. But the everyday paths of rural medieval life were often local, improvised, repaired only when necessary, and vulnerable to weather. A road could be not a single fixed line, but a worn habit across land. The place where people had gone so often that the earth remembered them. And when the weather turned, that memory became a trench. For the ordinary person, shoes were not the protective technology we take for granted today. A medieval leather shoe could be skillfully made and well suited to its world, but leather absorbs water. Soles were thin. Seams leaked. Repairs mattered. A good pair of shoes had value, and people did not always own many pairs. In towns, some wore pattens, wooden overshoes that lifted the foot above the worst of the street. This small object reveals a great deal. Patten was not just a fashion accessory. It was a practical answer to a dirty problem. How to keep the foot, the shoe, and the hem of clothing away from the ground. But even a patten had limits. It could raise you above shallow muck, but not erase the smell, the splash, or the awkwardness of movement. Could make walking noisier and less stable. On uneven ground, it required care. And outside better-off urban circles, not everyone had the same access to such protection. For many, mud was felt directly through damp leather, cold toes, and the slow discomfort of clothing that would not dry quickly. This is one of the first hidden realities of medieval daily life. Dirt was not simply a matter of appearance. It affected warmth, health, labor, time, and dignity. Wet feet could make a working day miserable. Muddy clothes needed cleaning, but washing clothing required labor, water, fuel, space, and time. A cloak or woolen garment that became heavy with moisture did not instantly recover. Wool had advantages in cold weather, but once wet and fouled, it carried weight and smell. Linen underclothes could be washed more often, but laundering was hard work, usually falling heavily on women. The mud outside the door therefore reached into domestic labor. It did not stop at the threshold. The medieval house itself was not always a clean separation from the outside world. In poorer rural homes, floors might be beaten earth. Rushes or straw could be spread over them. Animals might be close by, sometimes under the same roof structure or in attached spaces. Smoke, damp, and dirt were ordinary presences. A muddy footstep indoors was not the same violation it would be in a modern carpeted home, but it still mattered. It added to the work of maintaining a livable space. And yet, we should be careful not to imagine medieval people as living in total filth without standards. They had ideas of cleanliness. They swept, washed, aired textiles, used herbs, spread fresh rushes, scraped shoes, and recognized bad smells. Towns issued rules about waste. Monasteries had washing routines. Wealthier households managed linens with care. Medieval people did not lack a sense of order. They lacked many of the infrastructures that make modern cleanliness seem effortless. That distinction is important. A muddy lane was not evidence of ignorance. It was evidence of a world where the struggle between order and environment had to be fought every day, by hand. In the countryside, the seasons shaped the experience of walking more than any calendar of festivals or royal events. Spring brought thaw and soft ground. Fields needed work, animals moved more often, and paths that had been frozen or firm became unstable. Summer could dry the earth into dust and ruts, but storms could turn that dust back into paste. Autumn brought harvest, carts loaded with grain, fruit, wood, and hay, all pressing into lanes already softened by rain. Winter brought perhaps the strangest variety. Hard frozen surfaces in the morning, slick thaw by afternoon, icy puddles, and deep mud beneath thin crusts of cold earth. For agricultural workers, walking through mud was not merely an inconvenience on the way to work. It was part of the work. Fields had to be reached. Tools had to be carried. Animals had to be moved. Firewood had to be gathered. Water had to be fetched. Grain had to be taken to the mill. Rents and dues had to be delivered. Church attendance, market days, court obligations, and seasonal labor all required movement. A person could not simply decide that the road was unpleasant and stay inside. This gives us a more realistic understanding of medieval endurance. It was not always heroic. It was often repetitive. The body learned how to step, how to balance, how to judge the firmness of ground, how to avoid the deepest rut, how to place weight on a narrow strip beside a puddle. Children learned this early. The elderly felt it more sharply. A pregnant woman, a person carrying a load, or someone with an injury would experience the same lane very differently from a healthy young laborer. The ground itself created inequality. The wealthy did not escape mud completely, but they could reduce contact with it. They could ride rather than walk. They could own better footwear. They could send servants into the street. They could live in houses with improved floors, courtyards, stables, and sometimes paved or cobbled approaches. In towns, prosperous districts were more likely to benefit from investment in surfaces and drainage. A noble entering a muddy village might experience it as a temporary unpleasantness. A villager experienced it as the medium of life. Still, even status had limits. A horse could stumble. Cart could stick. A lord's messenger could be delayed. A bishop's procession could be dirted. Mud was one of those medieval forces that reminded everyone, however gently or rudely, that authority did not command the weather. And roads mattered because movement mattered. Medieval Europe was not as still as it is sometimes imagined. Peasants went to market. Merchants traveled between towns. Pilgrims crossed regions. Soldiers marched. Students walked to universities. Craftsmen moved for work. Officials carried messages. Monks and friars traveled between religious houses. The world was slower than ours, but not frozen. Every form of movement had to negotiate the surface beneath it. A muddy road could raise the cost of grain because carts moved more slowly. It could delay a messenger carrying legal or political news. It could make a market less profitable if buyers stayed away. It could isolate a village during heavy weather. It could make childbirth more dangerous if a midwife had to be fetched from elsewhere. It could even affect justice, because attending a manorial court or town court required appearing at the right time and place. Bad roads were not merely a rural nuisance. They were part of the structure of power. This is where the topic becomes deeper than it first appears. Mud was not just mud. It was friction in the medieval system. It slowed the economy. It marked class difference. It shaped architecture. It influenced clothing. It changed how people planned journeys, where towns invested money, how communities organized labor, and how much of daily life was spent compensating for physical inconvenience. The more we notice it, the more we begin to see the Middle Ages not as a distant costume drama, but as a world of surfaces, smells, weights, textures, and delays. Nowhere was this more visible than in towns. A medieval town could be lively, crowded, and economically ambitious, but its streets were not automatically clean or paved. Some major streets in wealthy towns might be cobbled or maintained with stone, timber, gravel, or other materials. Certain bridges, market areas, and important routes received attention. But many side lanes remained muddy, narrow, dark, and busy with people and animals. Waste disposal was a constant issue. Rain did not simply wash streets clean. It mixed what was already there and carried it downhill, into gutters, yards, streams, and low places. The smell of a medieval street after rain is difficult to reconstruct fully, but we can understand its ingredients. Animal dung, spilled food, fish waste, butcher's refuse, wood smoke, human waste where disposal was poor, wet wool, damp leather, stagnant water, and churned soil. Not every street was always disgusting, and medieval towns varied greatly. But the idea of the street as a clean public corridor is mostly modern. In the medieval mind, the street was a shared working space. It was where goods were sold, animals passed, neighbors met, apprentices carried materials, and household waste too often escaped private control. That made walking through a town a sensory act. You listened for carts. You watched for animals. You avoided splashes. You stepped around refuse. You kept close to walls where the ground was firmer, unless water dripped from roofs. You crossed lanes carefully. In some places, stepping stones or raised walkways helped. In others, you simply accepted that your shoes would suffer. The rich visual beauty we associate with medieval towns, the timbered houses, church towers, market crosses, painted signs, existed alongside this earthier reality. In fact, that contrast is part of what makes the period so compelling. A person might pass from the muddy street into a church filled with incense, painted saints, and candlelight. The same shoes that had just crossed filth might stand on stone before an altar. Medieval life often placed the sacred and the dirty astonishingly close together. And perhaps people did not find that contradiction as strange as we do. For them, the body belonged to the world. Work, weather, animals, and decay were not hidden away as completely as modern life tries to hide them. Mud did not mean life had failed. It meant life was being lived through the materials available. Earth, straw, wood, leather, wool, water, dung, ash, and stone were not background details. They were the vocabulary of existence. But familiarity did not mean comfort. There were moments when mud became dangerous. A road in poor condition could cause carts to overturn. A person could fall while carrying a heavy load. Livestock could be injured. In winter, mud mixed with ice could make movement treacherous. Flooded paths could conceal holes. Deep ruts could trap wheels. A journey that seemed short in distance could become exhausting in effort. For travelers, this mattered greatly. Medieval travel accounts, administrative records, and local complaints often reveal concern with bridges, causeways, and roads. A bridge washed out or a route turned impassable could reshape movement across an entire area. Communities were sometimes required to maintain roads or river crossings, though responsibility could be contested. Everyone needed roads, but not everyone wanted to pay for them. This is another very medieval problem. Public need and local burden rarely matched neatly. A muddy road might serve merchants from outside the village, a lord's interests, church officials, and local peasants all at once. But who repaired it? Who supplied labor? Who provided stone, timber, gravel, or brushwood? Who decided which section mattered most? In many places, road maintenance was not a centralized service as modern people expect. It depended on custom, obligation, charity, local government, lordship, or occasional royal attention. The result could be practical but uneven. So when we picture someone walking through mud every day, we should not imagine only an unlucky individual with dirty shoes. We should imagine an entire system in which infrastructure was fragile, labor was expensive, materials were local, and weather had authority. This brings us to the medieval foot itself. A modern person usually walks on engineered surfaces. Pavement, tile, asphalt, concrete, treated wood, indoor flooring. The medieval person walked across surfaces that changed constantly. The same route could be firm in August, slippery in November, frozen in January, flooded in March, and dusty in July. Feet, ankles, knees, and backs adapted to this unstable world. A person carrying a basket, a pail, a sack of grain, or a bundle of wood had to move with practical intelligence. There was a skill to walking, not a skill people would boast about, perhaps, but one learned through repetition. Where to step, how to test ground, how to use a staff, how to keep a cloak lifted, how to avoid losing a shoe in suctioning mud, how to walk beside a cart without being sprayed, how to move animals through a narrow lane without being pushed into the worst of it. The more we think about it, the more the medieval street becomes not a passive setting but an active participant in daily life. And this is only the beginning, because mud did not merely affect movement outside the home. It shaped what people built, what they wore, how they worked, how they smelled, how they judged status, and how they understood the boundary between hardship and normality. To see that more clearly, we have to follow the mud from the village lane into the household, the workshop, the marketplace, and the fields, where every footprint connected the ordinary body to the larger medieval world. To see that more clearly, we have to follow the mud from the village lane into the household, the workshop, the marketplace, and the fields, where every footprint connected the ordinary body to the larger medieval world. The first thing we notice when we step inside a medieval home is that the boundary between outdoors and indoors was often far less absolute than it is today. Modern buildings are designed to resist the environment. They are sealed, insulated, drained, and elevated above moisture. Medieval buildings certainly attempted to protect their occupants, but they existed in a constant negotiation with weather, soil, smoke, and water. Even a well-maintained house could not entirely escape the realities of the landscape around it. A muddy lane did not simply remain outside the door. The person returning from the fields carried traces of the earth on their shoes. A child running errands tracked dirt across thresholds. Water dripped from cloaks hung near the fire. Dogs wandered in and out. Farm tools arrived coated in soil. Baskets of vegetables came from damp ground. Firewood was dragged through rain before reaching the hearth. Daily life involved a continuous effort to manage these intrusions. This effort rarely appears in grand historical narratives because it was considered ordinary. Yet ordinary labor consumed enormous amounts of human time. A medieval household functioned only because someone was constantly sweeping, shaking out textiles, moving rushes, drying garments, cleaning tools, emptying waste, carrying water, and responding to the countless small consequences of living close to the natural world. The floor itself reveals much about this reality. In poorer homes, beaten earth floors remained common for centuries. Such floors could be practical and durable, but they were not immune to dampness. During wet seasons, moisture could creep upward. Muddy shoes added to the problem. Fresh rushes were sometimes spread to improve comfort and absorb dirt. Over time, these coverings had to be replaced. The romantic image of fragrant herbs scattered across medieval floors contains a small kernel of truth, but the reality was more practical than decorative. Aromatic plants could help freshen a room, yet they could not eliminate the constant challenge of maintaining cleanliness in a world without modern sanitation systems. Even wealthier households faced similar struggles, although on different terms. Stone floors might be easier to clean than earth. Servants could be assigned to maintenance. Better drainage could reduce dampness. Yet rain still arrived. Mud still clung to boots. Horses still crossed courtyards. Deliveries still entered through gates. Status reduced inconvenience. It rarely eliminated it. This becomes especially clear when we consider clothing. Many people today imagine medieval garments as permanently dirty or uncomfortable. In reality, clothing represented a significant investment. Even ordinary garments required valuable labor and materials. Wool had to be produced, spun, woven, cut, sewn, repaired, and maintained. Linen required equally demanding processes. People cared about their clothes because replacing them was expensive. That made mud more than a nuisance. A peasant woman walking to market might carefully lift her skirts above the worst sections of a road. A merchant crossing town could try to avoid puddles that might stain expensive fabric. Apprentices, laborers, and servants all learned practical techniques for navigating difficult streets while protecting garments that needed to last for years. In some illustrations from the later Middle Ages, we can even see people visibly gathering their clothing while moving through muddy conditions. Such images remind us that medieval people noticed the same inconveniences we would. They simply lacked many of the tools we now use to solve them. One of the most revealing examples comes from urban life. When people imagine medieval towns, they often focus on markets, guilds, cathedrals, and walls. Yet the physical reality of moving through those towns could be surprisingly difficult. Consider a busy market day. Farmers arrive before sunrise. Carts loaded with produce enter through gates. Horses stamp through puddles. Merchants unload goods. Customers crowd into narrow streets. Livestock may be driven directly through town. Rain from previous days has softened the ground. Within hours, hundreds or thousands of feet have churned the same surfaces. The result is not simply mud. It is a constantly changing landscape of footprints, ruts, standing water, refuse, animal waste, dropped straw, and compressed soil. Town authorities understood this problem very well. Throughout medieval Europe, municipal governments frequently issued regulations concerning drainage, street maintenance, waste disposal, and paving. The existence of such rules tells us something important. People complained. Residents disliked filthy streets. Merchants wanted better access. Property owners worried about flooding. Travelers preferred reliable routes. Local officials recognized that poor infrastructure could damage trade and reputation. In other words, medieval people were not indifferent to urban conditions. They were actively attempting to improve them, often with limited resources. Some towns invested heavily in paving important roads. Others focused on market districts where commercial activity justified the expense. Stone, gravel, timber walkways, and drainage ditches all appeared in various combinations depending on local circumstances. Yet progress was uneven. A visitor might walk along a well-maintained commercial street and then turn a corner into a lane that looked entirely different. This unevenness created an interesting contradiction. The Middle Ages are often portrayed as uniformly primitive, but the reality was far more varied. Certain locations developed surprisingly sophisticated solutions to everyday problems. Others struggled with basic maintenance. Two neighborhoods separated by only a few minutes' walk could provide completely different experiences, and weather always retained the final vote. A beautifully maintained street could become difficult after days of rain. A carefully constructed drainage channel could overflow. A repaired road could be damaged again within a season. This constant cycle shaped medieval attitudes toward infrastructure. Roads were never truly finished. They were maintained, neglected, repaired, damaged, improved, and rebuilt in an ongoing process that mirrored the rhythms of agriculture itself. The people who suffered most from failure were often those whose livelihoods depended upon movement. Take the example of a small trader. Unlike a wealthy merchant operating across regions, a local trader might travel only a few miles between villages. Yet those few miles mattered enormously. Fresh goods needed to arrive on time. Market opportunities could be missed. Perishable products spoiled. Animals grew tired. Every muddy stretch increased costs. A road that delayed travel by a few hours might determine whether a day's journey was profitable or disappointing. The same principle applied to craftsmen. A blacksmith needed supplies. A miller relied on deliveries. Builders required timber and stone. Even occupations that seemed stationary depended on transportation networks that functioned only as well as the roads beneath them. This is one reason historians increasingly view infrastructure as central to understanding medieval society. Not because roads were glamorous, because roads connected everything else. A monastery required supplies. A castle required provisions. A town required food. An army required movement. A kingdom required communication. and all of these needs eventually reached the ground beneath someone's feet. There is another aspect of mud that modern people rarely consider: noise. When we imagine medieval environments, we often focus on visual details. Yet sound played an equally important role. Dry roads sounded different from wet roads. A horse's hooves striking firm ground produced sharp rhythms. The same horse moving through mud created duller, heavier sounds. Cartwheels creaked differently depending on conditions. Footsteps changed. Even conversation could be affected. Travelers walking through difficult terrain devoted more attention to movement and less to leisurely discussion. Weather altered not only the appearance of a place but also its acoustic character. A muddy village after rain sounded different from the same village during a dry summer. These subtle sensory shifts shaped daily experience in ways rarely captured by written records. The smell changed, the sound changed, the pace changed, the physical effort changed. Everything became slightly heavier. And heaviness is perhaps one of the best words for understanding the relationship between medieval people and mud. Heavy shoes, heavy clothing, heavy carts, heavy air before rain, heavy labor, heavy roads. Modern transportation allows us to move enormous distances while barely noticing the surface beneath us. Medieval people could never fully ignore it. The earth constantly reminded them of its presence. This becomes even clearer when we leave the town entirely and follow one of the countless routes used by travelers moving between settlements. A journey of 20 miles today feels relatively modest. For many medieval people, it represented a significant undertaking. Distance itself was only part of the challenge. The condition of the route mattered just as much. Travel accounts repeatedly mention roads, rivers, bridges, ferries, weather, and terrain. This was not because medieval travelers were unusually interested in infrastructure. It was because infrastructure directly affected survival, comfort, and timing. A flooded crossing could force lengthy detours. A damaged bridge could halt movement entirely. A muddy road could turn a manageable journey into an exhausting one. Pilgrims understood this particularly well. The medieval world contained countless pilgrimage routes connecting shrines, churches, monasteries, and holy sites. Some journeys lasted days. Others lasted months. Popular imagination sometimes treats pilgrimage as a purely spiritual exercise, but pilgrims also faced intensely physical realities. Blisters, cold, rain, fatigue, and very often mud. The sacred destination might inspire the traveler, but the road demanded practical endurance. A pilgrim approaching a famous shrine after weeks of travel was not floating through a romantic landscape. They were likely tired, dirty, and familiar with every variety of difficult ground the journey had presented. Yet there was something almost democratic about the road. Kings, merchants, priests, laborers, students, and pilgrims all confronted many of the same environmental obstacles. Their resources differed enormously. Their accommodations differed. Their clothing differed. But a storm could disrupt everyone's plans. In that sense, mud acted as one of the great equalizers of medieval life. Not perfectly, of course. Wealth still mattered. Power still mattered. But weather possessed an authority that no title could entirely dismiss. Perhaps that is why roads appear so frequently in medieval records, legal disputes, local obligations, and community projects. People understood that movement was life. When roads functioned, communities remained connected. When roads failed, problems multiplied. Trade slowed. News traveled more slowly. Prices changed. Opportunities disappeared. Isolation increased. And nowhere was this relationship between movement and survival more obvious than during the agricultural year itself, when entire communities depended upon transporting harvests across landscapes that could become treacherous with astonishing speed. As autumn clouds gathered over fields already marked by cart tracks and countless footsteps, villagers knew that the success of months of labor might depend not only on what had grown in the soil, but on whether that soil would allow the harvest to reach its destination. As autumn clouds gathered over fields already marked by cart tracks and countless footsteps, villagers knew that the success of months of labor might depend not only on what had grown in the soil, but on whether that soil would allow the harvest to reach its destination. This is one of the less obvious reasons mud mattered so deeply in medieval life. A modern observer might look at a muddy road and see inconvenience. A medieval farmer often saw risk. The agricultural calendar left surprisingly little room for delay. Grain had to be harvested within a certain window. Hay needed to be gathered before weather ruined it. Firewood had to be collected and stored before winter deepened. Livestock required fodder. Rents, tithes, and obligations still had to be met regardless of conditions underfoot. Every journey became part of a larger chain of necessity. Imagine a village during the harvest season. The fields are active from early morning until dusk. Men and women cut grain with sickles. Children gather scattered stalks. Carts wait at field edges. Horses and oxen stand patiently as loads are assembled. Now imagine several days of heavy rain. The grain still exists. The labor has already been spent. The need remains urgent. Yet suddenly the landscape becomes resistant. Cartwheels sink deeper. Animals struggle for traction. Workers expend more energy transporting every load. A journey that normally takes 30 minutes may consume an hour or more. Repeated trips become exhausting. Precious daylight disappears. The problem is not dramatic enough to appear in most heroic histories, and yet it directly affected survival. This is one of the recurring themes of medieval daily life. The greatest pressures were often not spectacular events but accumulations of small obstacles. A harvest was not ruined because one cart became stuck. It was endangered when dozens of small delays reduced efficiency day after day. Weather transformed labor. A field and a road could never be understood separately. This relationship shaped settlement patterns across much of medieval Europe. Villages were not placed randomly. Access to water, fertile land, grazing areas, woodland resources, and transportation routes all influenced where communities developed. Yet even well-positioned settlements remained vulnerable to seasonal conditions. The landscape constantly negotiated with human ambition. People built roads because they needed movement. Rain reshaped roads because rain did not care. This simple reality generated an endless cycle of adaptation. Brushwood might be laid across wet ground. Stones might be gathered and spread. Drainage ditches could be cleared. Temporary paths emerged beside damaged routes. Communities redirected traffic around particularly difficult sections. Sometimes these solutions worked remarkably well. Sometimes they merely made a bad situation slightly less unpleasant. What is striking is not that medieval infrastructure occasionally failed. What is striking is how often it functioned at all. Consider the sheer volume of movement occurring every year. Food traveled from farms to towns. Wool moved from countryside to workshops. Timber left forests. Stone reached construction sites. Wine, salt, fish, cloth, metal goods, pottery, and countless other products crossed regions. Pilgrims journeyed between shrines. Students traveled to schools and universities. Officials carried messages. Merchants followed trade routes. The roads may have been imperfect, but they carried the lifeblood of society. This creates another useful correction to modern assumptions. The Middle Ages are sometimes imagined as static, isolated, and immobile. In reality, movement was constant. Most people may have spent much of their lives near their place of birth, but that did not mean their communities were disconnected from wider networks. Even a remote village participated in larger systems. The salt on a table may have traveled considerable distances. The iron in a tool came from somewhere. The priest had likely studied elsewhere. News arrived from outside. Goods appeared from distant regions. All of these connections ultimately depended on physical transportation. And transportation depended on roads, which meant very often it depended on mud. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the lives of merchants. A successful merchant needed knowledge of routes, seasons, weather patterns, river crossings, and local conditions. Commercial skill involved much more than buying and selling. It required understanding terrain. An experienced trader knew which roads deteriorated after rain. They knew where carts commonly became trapped. They knew which bridges were reliable and which crossings were best avoided during certain seasons. In a sense, geography became part of business strategy. The earth itself entered economic calculations. This may sound strange to modern listeners accustomed to paved highways and satellite navigation. Yet, for much of human history, transportation planning involved constant awareness of environmental conditions. A merchant leaving town did not merely ask where they were going. They asked what the road would be like when they got there. Such concerns appear repeatedly in historical records because they mattered repeatedly in practice. A delayed shipment could affect profits. A damaged cart required repairs. Tired animals needed rest. Bad roads increased costs. The economic consequences of mud extended far beyond dirty boots. They reached markets, prices, and trade networks. At the same time, mud could create unexpected opportunities. Certain occupations benefited from the constant struggle against poor conditions. Road maintenance generated labor. Cart repair supported craftsmen. Blacksmiths produced horseshoes and hardware. Wheelwrights built and repaired wheels. Bridge construction employed workers. Innkeepers served travelers delayed by weather. The inconveniences of transportation helped sustain entire sectors of medieval economies. This is another subtle historical pattern worth noticing. Problems often create systems. The difficulties people face become sources of work for others. Medieval society was full of such relationships. Roads generated mud. Mud generated repairs. Repairs generated employment. Employment generated income. Income circulated through communities. Nothing existed entirely in isolation. Even something as simple as a muddy lane connected multiple layers of social and economic life. The same principle applied within towns. Urban governments frequently invested resources into improving streets not purely out of civic pride, but because movement produced prosperity. Markets functioned more efficiently when people could reach them. Merchants preferred accessible locations. Customers spent more time shopping when conditions were tolerable. Goods moved more easily. Taxes were collected more reliably. Infrastructure improvements often reflected practical financial logic. Cleanliness and profitability frequently traveled together. Yet there remained a persistent challenge. Every improvement required maintenance. A newly paved section of street was not a permanent victory. Stone shifted, drainage clogged, traffic caused wear, animals damaged surfaces, weather intervened. The work never truly ended. Medieval people understood this intuitively because they lived within cycles rather than final solutions. Fields required annual cultivation. Buildings required repairs. Tools needed sharpening. Clothing demanded mending. Roads required maintenance. The expectation of permanence was rare. Instead, life involved continual stewardship. Perhaps this helps explain why many medieval communities organized collective labor obligations. Certain tasks were simply too large for individuals acting alone. Bridges needed attention. Roads needed repair. Flood defenses required maintenance. The functioning of the community depended upon cooperation, even when cooperation was reluctant. Not everyone welcomed these responsibilities. Records reveal disputes, complaints, and arguments over who should contribute labor, materials, or money. People have always preferred that someone else handle expensive infrastructure. The medieval period was no exception. Yet, despite disagreements, the work generally continued because the alternatives were worse. An unusable road harmed everyone eventually. This became particularly obvious during periods of bad weather. Imagine a prolonged season of rain. The first storm creates puddles. The second deepens ruts. The third overwhelms drainage. Soon sections of road become increasingly difficult. Traffic concentrates on slightly higher ground. That higher ground begins to deteriorate as well. Animals seek firmer footing elsewhere. Pedestrians carve new paths. The landscape slowly changes shape beneath repeated pressure. Roads were not static objects. They were living features of the environment. In some places, routes literally shifted over time as people adapted to changing conditions. The road was where people walked. If conditions forced them elsewhere, the road could gradually move. This flexibility is difficult for modern minds accustomed to fixed infrastructure. Yet it made practical sense. People responded to reality rather than maps. The ground determined behavior. This dynamic relationship between people and terrain becomes even more interesting when viewed through the experiences of travelers arriving in unfamiliar places. A stranger entering a village immediately noticed local conditions. The quality of roads, the state of drainage, the arrangement of buildings, the location of wells, the accessibility of markets, all provided information about the community. Infrastructure communicated social realities. Well-maintained routes suggested organization, resources, or commercial importance. Neglected roads might indicate poverty, isolation, or competing priorities. Travelers formed impressions long before speaking to residents. Their feet gathered evidence with every step. Even religious institutions paid close attention to these practical concerns. Monasteries often occupied significant positions within transportation networks. Pilgrims, merchants, and visitors passed through. Goods arrived regularly. Agricultural estates required management. Movement mattered. Many monasteries invested considerable effort into maintaining access routes, bridges, and crossings because their economic and spiritual activities depended upon reliable transportation. A monastery isolated by poor roads faced difficulties obtaining supplies, managing lands, and hosting travelers. The sacred world remained connected to practical realities. Indeed, one of the most revealing aspects of medieval life is how frequently lofty ideals encountered muddy roads. A scholar traveling to a university still had to navigate difficult terrain. A bishop conducting official business still depended upon transportation networks. A messenger carrying royal orders still risked delays. The ambitions of institutions repeatedly met the limitations of geography. Sometimes geography won. There is something deeply human in this recurring tension. People planned. Nature responded. People adapted. The cycle continued. And nowhere did adaptation become more creative than in the footwear itself. The simple act of protecting one's feet generated an entire range of solutions. Shoes, boots, patents, repairs, reinforcements, specialized designs for different environments. All reflected the importance of walking in a world where the ground could not be taken for granted. A person's relationship with their footwear was often far more intimate than ours today. Shoes represented investment. Shoes required maintenance. Shoes preserved mobility. Losing a shoe in deep mud was not merely embarrassing. It could create genuine hardship. Some muddy roads became notorious for exactly this reason. Deep, sticky conditions could grip footwear with surprising force. Travelers occasionally found themselves extracting feet from shoes or struggling to recover footwear swallowed by soft ground. What sounds almost comical to modern ears was a perfectly practical concern. A damaged or lost shoe affected every journey afterward. The road extracted a cost. And as medieval communities continued searching for ways to reduce that cost, through paving projects, drainage efforts, communal labor, and countless local innovations, the struggle against mud gradually became part of a larger story about how people attempted to shape their environment without ever fully controlling it. That story becomes even more visible when we look beyond ordinary roads and examine the places where mud, water, and movement met most dramatically. The bridges, river crossings, and causeways that connected entire regions and determined whether travelers moved forward or found themselves stopped by the landscape itself. That story becomes even more visible when we look beyond ordinary roads and examine the places where mud, water, and movement met most dramatically. The bridges, river crossings, and causeways that connected entire regions and determined whether travelers moved forward or found themselves stopped by the landscape itself. For all the attention given to medieval roads, there was often something even more important than the road itself: the crossing. A road could be muddy, rutted, and unpleasant, yet still usable. A river without a bridge was another matter entirely. Throughout medieval Europe, rivers shaped movement as powerfully as mountains, forests, or political borders. In some cases, they served as convenient transportation routes. In others, they became obstacles that concentrated traffic into a handful of critical crossing points. This meant that a bridge was never merely a bridge. It was a solution to a problem that every traveler shared. Imagine approaching a river after several days of rain. The road behind you has already been difficult. Your shoes are damp. Your horse is tired. The cart wheels have accumulated thick layers of mud. The sky remains gray. Ahead, the river runs higher than usual. The crossing that seemed straightforward a week earlier now demands caution. For a merchant, delay means expense. For a messenger, delay means consequences. For a pilgrim, delay means uncertainty. For local villagers, delay may affect access to markets, mills, churches, or neighboring communities. A great deal could depend on a single crossing. This is why bridges occupied such an important place in medieval life. Communities invested enormous effort into building and maintaining them. Religious institutions supported bridge construction. Wealthy benefactors funded repairs. Local authorities argued over responsibilities. Travelers paid tolls. Charitable foundations sometimes emerged specifically to maintain crossings for public use. The existence of these arrangements reveals how valuable reliable movement had become. People were willing to spend significant resources simply to avoid being stopped by water. Yet, even the finest bridge remained vulnerable to the same forces affecting the roads around it. Floods could undermine foundations. Timber decayed. Ice damaged structures. Heavy traffic produced wear. Storms caused destruction. The medieval world contained countless examples of bridges requiring constant attention. Again, we encounter the same pattern. Infrastructure was rarely permanent. It was a continuing relationship between human effort and environmental pressure. This relationship becomes particularly visible when we consider causeways. A causeway was essentially a raised route built across wet ground, marshland, flood-prone terrain, or other difficult environments. In many regions, these structures became essential lifelines. To a modern traveler, a causeway may not appear especially remarkable. To a medieval traveler, it could mean the difference between progress and complete frustration. A slightly elevated path might keep feet dry. It might allow carts to pass where otherwise they would become trapped. It might remain usable after weather that rendered surrounding land impassable. Such improvements could dramatically alter local life. The interesting thing is that people often remembered them. Roads and crossings entered local memory because they affected daily experience so directly. Villagers knew which routes became dangerous after storms. Merchants learned which crossings offered the most reliability. Travelers exchanged information about conditions ahead. Knowledge of terrain became a practical form of expertise. The medieval traveler carried far less written information than modern travelers do. There were no weather forecasts available at a glance. No digital maps. No instant updates. Instead, knowledge moved through conversation. An innkeeper might warn of flooding. A farmer might report damaged roads. A merchant arriving from another town might describe conditions several miles away. Information itself traveled along the same muddy routes as people. In a sense, roads carried news just as surely as they carried goods. And news mattered, because the condition of roads and crossings could influence events far beyond local inconvenience. Consider the movement of armies. Popular history often focuses on battles themselves. Yet military campaigns depended heavily on logistics. Thousands of soldiers, animals, wagons, supplies, weapons, and provisions had to move through real landscapes. Mud became an active participant in warfare, not because it fought anyone directly, because it shaped what armies could accomplish. An army moving along a dry route could cover ground relatively efficiently. The same army moving through mud slowed dramatically. Supply wagons struggled. Animals exhausted themselves. Equipment deteriorated. Communication became more difficult. Commanders learned quickly that weather could be as influential as enemy action. Many military campaigns across history have encountered this reality. The medieval period was no exception. Yet even here, it is important not to imagine mud solely as an enemy. Sometimes difficult terrain provided protection. A village surrounded by marshy ground could be harder to attack. A fortified position near wetlands gained natural advantages. Local people often understood terrain better than outsiders. Knowledge of usable paths became valuable. What looked like an impassable landscape to a stranger might contain routes familiar to residents. The environment could conceal opportunities as well as obstacles. This reminds us that medieval people were not simply victims of geography. They adapted continuously. They learned. They developed practical knowledge accumulated over generations. A child raised in a particular village might know exactly which route remained firm after heavy rain, which stream crossing became dangerous in winter, and which shortcut saved time during harvest season. Such knowledge rarely appears in written records because it seemed too ordinary to document. Yet it represented genuine expertise. The ability to read the landscape was a survival skill. And nowhere was this more apparent than among people whose livelihoods depended upon animals. Livestock transformed roads in ways modern audiences sometimes overlook. Horses receive much attention in medieval history, and understandably so. They played important roles in transport, agriculture, warfare, and status display. But horses were only part of the picture. Oxen pulled carts. Cattle moved between pastures. Sheep traveled along established routes. Pigs wandered near settlements. The cumulative impact of thousands upon thousands of animals reshaped the ground. Every hoof compressed soil. Every journey deepened ruts. Every season left physical traces. Roads were not merely used by animals. Roads were partly created by animals. The medieval landscape emerged from a partnership between human intentions and animal movement. This partnership influenced everything from trade to agriculture. A heavily traveled livestock route could become difficult for pedestrians. A muddy section of road might affect how herds were moved. Seasonal migrations of animals altered traffic patterns. The rhythms of animal life blended with the rhythms of human life. And all of it happened on the same surfaces, The more closely we examine medieval roads, the more they resemble shared ecosystems rather than simple transportation corridors. People moved through them. Animals moved through them. Water moved through them. Goods moved through them. Ideas moved through them. Nothing remained isolated. This interconnectedness becomes particularly fascinating when we consider towns located at major crossroads. Such places often gained importance precisely because movement converged there. Roads met, traders arrived, markets expanded, services developed, economic opportunities multiplied. Yet success created new problems. More traffic meant more wear. More animals meant more waste. More carts meant deeper ruts. Growth increased pressure on infrastructure. A prosperous town frequently faced greater maintenance challenges than a quiet village. Success literally churned the ground beneath its feet. Urban authorities recognized this reality. Many municipal records reveal persistent concerns about street conditions. Officials ordered repairs, established regulations, imposed fines, and organized labor, not because they were obsessed with tidiness, because functioning streets supported functioning economies. There is a subtle lesson hidden here. Infrastructure becomes most visible when it fails. When roads work reasonably well, people rarely discuss them. When roads deteriorate, everyone notices. The same was true in the Middle Ages. A merchant arriving late because of poor conditions remembered the experience. A resident forced to navigate flooding remembered it. A traveler trapped by impassable routes remembered it. Complaints survive in historical records partly because difficulties generated attention. Routine success often left fewer traces. This can sometimes distort our understanding of the past. When we encounter repeated references to muddy roads, we might imagine a world where movement was impossible. In reality, movement occurred constantly. The very existence of trade networks, pilgrimage routes, universities, markets, and political systems demonstrates that transportation generally functioned. The roads were often difficult. They were not usually useless. This distinction matters. Medieval people were remarkably capable of operating within conditions that modern travelers would find frustrating. Their expectations differed. Their techniques differed. Their relationship with time differed. A journey delayed by weather was often inconvenient, but it was rarely surprising. People planned around uncertainty because uncertainty was normal. In some ways, this fostered a practical patience that modern societies often struggle to maintain. Travel required flexibility. Work required adaptation. Nature set conditions that could not always be negotiated. A person might leave home expecting a certain journey time and arrive much later. The world simply worked that way. Yet this patience should not be mistaken for passivity. Communities continually sought improvements. Roads were repaired. Bridges were rebuilt. Causeways were raised. Drainage was expanded. Technology evolved. Knowledge accumulated. People searched constantly for better solutions. One particularly revealing example involves paving. Today, paved surfaces seem ordinary. We barely notice them. For medieval communities, paving represented a significant investment. Stone had to be obtained, transported, positioned, and maintained. Labor costs mattered. Materials mattered. Planning mattered. As a result, paving often appeared first in places where traffic justified the expense. Market districts, important streets, bridge approaches, commercial centers. The choice of where to pave reveals local priorities. A town effectively announced which routes mattered most. These improvements could transform daily experience. A section of paved road remained firmer during wet weather. Traffic moved more efficiently. Shoes stayed cleaner. Cart wheels encountered fewer difficulties. Small changes produced cumulative benefits. Yet even paved streets existed within larger environmental systems. Rain still fell. Mud still accumulated. Animals still passed through. Maintenance remained necessary. The battle against mud was never fully won, only managed, and perhaps that is one of the most revealing insights into medieval daily life. People did not expect perfect control over their surroundings. They expected negotiation, accommodation, adjustment. The goal was not to eliminate nature's influence entirely. The goal was to live with it successfully enough to keep society functioning. That mindset becomes even clearer when we move away from roads and bridges themselves and look at the communities built beside them. Places where travelers stopped, rested, exchanged information, repaired equipment, and prepared themselves for whatever conditions waited on the next stretch of muddy road. That mindset becomes even clearer when we move away from roads and bridges themselves and look at the communities built beside them. Places where travelers stopped, rested, exchanged information, repaired equipment, and prepared themselves for whatever conditions waited on the next stretch of muddy road. If roads were the veins of medieval society, then inns, taverns, hostels, monasteries, and roadside settlements were the points where circulation briefly slowed. These places existed because movement existed. And movement, as we have seen, was rarely effortless. A traveler arriving after several hours of walking through wet conditions was not merely seeking food. They were seeking recovery. Their boots might be soaked, their clothing damp, their cart in need of attention, their horse tired, their knowledge of the road ahead incomplete. Travel involved constant uncertainty. This uncertainty created demand for places where information could be gathered. A merchant entering an inn might immediately ask practical questions. How are the roads to the next town? Has the river risen? Is the bridge still passable? Have any carts become stuck on the eastern route? These questions sound mundane, but they reveal how medieval people understood travel. The condition of the road was not background information. It was often the most important information. A traveler could survive a poor meal. A traveler delayed for 2 days by impassable roads faced a more serious problem. This constant exchange of local knowledge formed an informal network stretching across regions. Long before modern weather services existed, communities collectively monitored their environment. People observed rivers. They watched the sky. They remembered which roads flooded first. They noted where carts became trapped. Knowledge accumulated through experience. And experience mattered because roads behaved differently from season to season. A route that worked beautifully in July might become a nightmare in November. This variability shaped travel habits in surprisingly sophisticated ways. Experienced merchants often adjusted schedules according to expected conditions. Pilgrims timed journeys around seasons. Local communities anticipated periods when movement would become more difficult. Medieval people did not simply react to mud. They planned around it. One of the easiest mistakes modern audiences make is assuming that because medieval technology was simpler, medieval decision-making was less intelligent. In reality, many people possessed highly detailed practical knowledge about landscapes, weather patterns, and transportation conditions. Their expertise simply took different forms. A village elder might know more about local drainage patterns than an engineer arriving from another region. A carter who spent decades moving goods between towns could possess an intimate understanding of road behavior that no written map could fully capture. Knowledge lived in memory. Knowledge lived in habit. Knowledge lived in repeated journeys. This becomes especially apparent when we consider the people whose livelihoods depended almost entirely upon transportation. The medieval carter occupied a fascinating position within society. Neither noble nor particularly celebrated, these individuals performed work essential to economic life. They moved grain, timber, stone, wool, food, tools, and countless other goods. and they spent much of their lives confronting roads directly. Few people understood mud better. A carter knew which sections became dangerous after rain. They knew how to balance loads. They understood the capabilities of their animals. They recognized the difference between difficult ground and impossible ground. This distinction mattered enormously. There were moments when persistence helped. There were moments when persistence merely buried a wheel deeper. Experience taught the difference. Imagine a heavily loaded cart approaching a muddy incline. The animals strain forward. The wheels begin to sink. Progress slows. The driver must decide whether to continue, lighten the load, seek assistance, or choose another route. Such decisions occurred constantly throughout the medieval world. Transportation was not a passive activity. It required judgment, and judgment developed through repetition. Many modern viewers imagine historical travel as monotonous, but the reality was often more demanding. Every journey required continual assessment of conditions. The road was never entirely predictable. Even familiar routes could surprise travelers after changes in weather. A section that seemed firm yesterday might become treacherous today. A stream that appeared harmless could swell rapidly. A shortcut might save time under ideal conditions but create problems under poor ones. Movement involved risk management. The landscape demanded attention. In some ways, medieval people may have been more aware of terrain than most modern travelers. Today, many of us move across engineered surfaces without consciously noticing them. Roads are expected to function. For medieval travelers, the condition of the ground remained a persistent consideration. It occupied mental space. People looked down more often. They evaluated surfaces more carefully. They paid attention to subtle changes. The earth itself became part of navigation. This heightened awareness influenced the design of settlements as well. Many villages developed around slightly elevated ground for practical reasons. Higher locations reduced flooding risks. Better drainage improved living conditions. Roads approaching these settlements often benefited from firmer surfaces. Elevation mattered. A few feet of height could significantly alter the experience of daily life. This is another reminder that medieval communities were not randomly arranged. People observed their environment carefully. Generations accumulated knowledge about which locations worked best. Not every settlement enjoyed ideal geography, of course. Historical circumstances, land ownership, water access, and countless other factors influenced development. Yet practical concerns remained important. No one enjoyed living permanently in mud. When opportunities existed to reduce discomfort, communities often pursued them. The challenge was that opportunities were rarely unlimited. Resources constrained choices. Stone required labor. Drainage required maintenance. Road improvements required investment. Every solution carried costs, and medieval societies, like all societies, operated within finite budgets of labor, materials, and time. This reality becomes particularly visible when we examine the contrast between wealthy and poor communities. A prosperous trading town might afford substantial paving projects. A small agricultural village often could not. The difference was not merely economic. It was physical. Residents experienced different versions of daily movement. A merchant in a successful commercial center might walk across increasingly improved streets. A peasant in a remote region continued navigating deeply rutted tracks. Yet even this contrast should not be exaggerated. Wealth improved conditions, but it rarely abolished environmental challenges entirely. Rain remained democratic. Storms crossed social boundaries. Floods ignored status. Nature distributed inconvenience with remarkable impartiality. A wealthy traveler might possess better boots, but they still encountered mud. A noble's horse could still stumble. A bishop's carriage could still become delayed. Environmental realities repeatedly reminded medieval society that some forms of power had limits. This is perhaps one reason weather occupies such a prominent place in historical records. People paid attention because weather affected everyone. Harvests depended upon it. Travel depended upon it. Roads depended upon it. Economic activity depended upon it. The relationship between weather and mud was especially significant during prolonged wet periods. Several consecutive weeks of rain could alter entire transportation networks. Roads deteriorated gradually. Each passing cart deepened ruts. Standing water expanded. Drainage systems struggled. Previously manageable routes became increasingly difficult. The effects accumulated. And accumulation is an important concept here. The medieval experience of mud was rarely about a single dramatic event. It was about repetition. Walking through mud once is an inconvenience. Walking through mud every day for months becomes a defining feature of life. This repeated exposure shaped behavior in subtle ways. People chose routes differently. They planned journeys carefully. They adjusted expectations. They modified clothing. They developed routines. Daily adaptation became second nature. A visitor might notice mud immediately. A resident noticed strategies. The resident knew where to place each step. The visitor only saw the obstacle. This difference between familiarity and unfamiliarity appears throughout history. People living within a system often become highly skilled at navigating challenges outsiders find surprising. Medieval roads offer a perfect example. What seems impossibly inconvenient to modern audiences frequently represented a manageable reality to those accustomed to it. Not pleasant, not easy, but manageable. That distinction deserves emphasis because popular portrayals sometimes drift toward extremes. Either the Middle Ages become romanticized as picturesque simplicity, or they become caricatured as endless misery. Reality occupied the space between. People complained about mud. They also lived with it successfully. They sought improvements. They adapted when improvements proved impossible. Life continued. Markets opened. Children played. Farmers worked. Merchants traveled. Religious festivals occurred. Communities functioned. The mud mattered because it imposed costs, not because it halted civilization. In fact, one of the most revealing aspects of medieval society is how effectively people maintained complex economic and social systems despite environmental obstacles that modern infrastructure largely conceals. The roads may have been imperfect, but they connected remarkably active worlds. Consider the annual fairs that attracted merchants from distant regions. These gatherings depended upon transportation. Goods traveled substantial distances. Traders coordinated arrivals. Communities prepared accommodations. Such events required roads that worked well enough, often enough, to sustain long-distance commerce. The existence of thriving medieval trade networks demonstrates that movement remained viable despite difficulties. Mud complicated transportation. It did not prevent it. This brings us to an interesting paradox. The more we study medieval roads, the more we discover both hardship and resilience. The roads were worse than many people imagine. The people were often more capable than many people imagine. Both realities can exist simultaneously. A muddy journey could be exhausting, could also be routine. A difficult road could frustrate travelers, could still support trade. An uncomfortable environment could generate practical expertise. Perhaps nowhere is this balance clearer than in the lives of children growing up within these landscapes. A child raised in a medieval village encountered mud not as an unusual challenge but as part of the world itself. They learned early how to move through difficult ground. They observed adults choosing routes. They helped with errands. They accompanied livestock. They participated in agricultural work. Skills developed gradually: balance, awareness, judgment, patience. The physical environment became an instructor. Many abilities that modern children learn through organized activities emerged naturally through daily interaction with the landscape. Walking itself became a form of education. Each season taught different lessons. Spring revealed soft ground. Summer demonstrated dust and ruts. Autumn brought harvest traffic. Winter introduced ice, thaw, and unpredictability. The road changed. People adapted. Year after year, generation after generation. And over centuries, these accumulated experiences shaped not only individual behavior but also collective expectations about work, travel, community responsibility, and the relationship between human beings and the environments they inhabited. That relationship becomes even more intriguing when we step away from the roads themselves and begin looking at the surprisingly inventive ways medieval people tried to keep their bodies, clothing, and homes functional in a world where mud seemed determined to follow them almost everywhere they went. That relationship becomes even more intriguing when we step away from the roads themselves and begin looking at the surprisingly inventive ways medieval people tried to keep their bodies, clothing, and homes functional in a world where mud seemed determined to follow them almost everywhere they went. One of the most misleading assumptions modern people bring to the Middle Ages is the belief that medieval communities simply accepted discomfort without attempting solutions. In reality, medieval life was filled with small technologies. Many were so ordinary that they rarely attract attention today. They were not grand inventions like cathedrals or siege engines. They were practical responses to recurring problems. A raised doorstep, a drainage ditch, a wooden walkway, a boot scraper, patten attached beneath a shoe. Each represented a simple idea. The ground is unpleasant. How can we make it slightly less unpleasant? The history of mud is, in many ways, a history of thousands of small adjustments. Consider the humble doorstep. Modern doorways often seem unremarkable because they exist within carefully controlled buildings. In medieval homes, however, the threshold occupied a more significant role. The threshold was a defensive line. Outside lay weather, dirt, animals, noise, and movement. Inside lay warmth, food preparation, sleep, storage, and family life. People crossing that boundary carried traces of the outside world with them. A raised threshold could help keep water out, could slow the movement of dirt indoors. It marked a transition between environments. Something as simple as stepping over a piece of timber represented an effort to preserve order against constant intrusion. The same logic appeared throughout medieval domestic life. Many households developed routines centered on managing contamination from outdoors. Shoes were cleaned, tools were stored, wet clothing was dried, floors were swept, rushes were replaced. These activities consumed time and energy, yet they also reveal something important. Medieval people cared deeply about maintaining habitable spaces. The stereotype of complete indifference to cleanliness becomes difficult to sustain when examining the amount of labor devoted to preventing homes from becoming unmanageable. Of course, standards differed from modern expectations. The goal was not sterile perfection. The goal was functionality. A house needed to remain comfortable enough to live in, and comfort often depended upon controlling moisture. Moisture was the hidden companion of mud. A muddy road could eventually dry. Moisture trapped within clothing, bedding, walls, or floors presented a more persistent challenge. This was especially true in northern regions where damp weather occurred frequently. A wet cloak represented more than inconvenience. It represented weight. A wool cloak soaked by rain became heavier, colder, and slower to dry. The wearer might spend hours carrying that additional burden. Now imagine repeating the experience several times each week. The cumulative effect becomes easier to understand. Medieval clothing was remarkably practical in many respects. Wool, in particular, retained warmth even when damp. This characteristic made it valuable throughout much of Europe. Yet practical does not mean comfortable by modern standards. People often spent significant portions of their lives managing wet textiles, drying garments near a fire, repairing damage, protecting clothing from excessive wear, trying to preserve valuable materials for as long as possible. Mud accelerated deterioration. A muddy hem wore faster. A muddy shoe aged more quickly. Repeated exposure gradually consumed resources. This is one reason clothing occupied such an important place within household economies. Garments represented stored labor. When mud damaged clothing, it indirectly damaged the time invested in creating that clothing. The relationship between mud and labor appears again and again. At first glance, mud seems like a physical substance. Upon closer examination, it becomes a force that converts time into effort. A muddy road requires more walking. A muddy cart requires more pulling. A muddy garment requires more cleaning. A muddy floor requires more maintenance. The material itself remains simple. The consequences spread outward. Perhaps nowhere is this more visible than in footwear. The medieval shoe existed in constant negotiation with the ground. Many surviving examples demonstrate impressive craftsmanship. Medieval shoemakers understood their trade. They produced footwear adapted to local conditions, available materials, and customer needs. Yet even the best shoe confronted limitations. Leather remains vulnerable to moisture. Soles wear down. Seams weaken. Repeated contact with mud and water takes its toll. This helps explain the popularity of pattens in many towns. A patten was essentially a protective overshoe, often made of wood and attached beneath ordinary footwear. To modern eyes, it can appear somewhat awkward. To medieval users, it made perfect sense. Why allow an expensive shoe to absorb every puddle if a removable platform could take the punishment instead? There is something quietly clever about the design. Rather than changing the road, people altered their relationship to the road. A few inches of elevation could dramatically improve comfort. Of course, pattens introduced new challenges. They could be noisy. They affected balance. They required practice. But they demonstrate a broader pattern. Medieval people continually experimented with ways to reduce environmental burdens. Innovation did not always arrive in dramatic forms. Sometimes innovation was simply finding a better way to stay above the mud. The same spirit appears in urban design. Many towns employed raised walkways, stepping stones, drainage channels, and carefully positioned paving. Visitors navigating busy streets often preferred routes offering slightly firmer footing. Over time, repeated preferences could shape how people moved through urban environments. Certain paths became popular because they were marginally less unpleasant. Marginal improvements mattered. When a problem occurs every day, even small advantages become valuable. This principle influenced medieval architecture as well. Buildings often responded to local conditions. In wetter regions, drainage demanded greater attention. In flood-prone areas, elevation became more important. In busy towns, street-facing structures adapted to heavy traffic. Architecture was not merely aesthetic. It was environmental strategy. The more closely we look, the more we see medieval communities engaged in continuous problem-solving. Not always successfully, not always efficiently, but persistently, people observed difficulties and sought workable responses. This practical mindset becomes especially apparent when examining marketplaces. Markets concentrated many of the challenges associated with mud. Large numbers of people gathered in one location. Animals arrived. Goods were unloaded. Temporary stalls appeared. Foot traffic intensified. The ground absorbed all of it. A busy market could transform conditions rapidly. What began as firm earth early in the morning might become heavily churned by midday. Repeated use altered surfaces in real time. This created incentives for improvement. Market authorities wanted customers to arrive. Merchants wanted access. Communities wanted economic activity. Better surfaces encouraged all three. As a result, some of the earliest paving projects focused on commercial areas. Economic importance often justified investment. This reveals another recurring truth. Mud was never merely an environmental issue. It was an economic issue. The condition of the ground influenced the movement of money as surely as it influenced the movement of people. A merchant choosing between two routes considered road quality. A customer deciding whether to attend a market considered conditions. Transportation costs affected prices. Infrastructure shaped opportunity. The economy literally rested upon the landscape. At the same time, there remained limits to what communities could achieve. Even well-maintained towns encountered overwhelming weather. A series of storms could undo months of work. Flooding could overwhelm drainage. Roads could deteriorate unexpectedly. This unpredictability influenced medieval attitudes toward planning. People prepared where possible. They improvised where necessary. Control remained partial. The environment always retained the ability to surprise. That surprise could arrive suddenly. A traveler setting out beneath clear skies might encounter heavy rain by afternoon. A road appearing firm in the morning could soften dramatically after several hours of weather. A stream crossing could change character within a single day. The medieval world demanded flexibility because conditions changed constantly. This flexibility extended beyond physical movement. It shaped expectations. Modern schedules often assume precision. Trains arrive at designated times. Deliveries follow estimates. Journeys are calculated carefully. Medieval time worked differently. Not because people lacked discipline, because environmental uncertainty imposed limits. Travel times were often approximate. Arrivals depended on conditions. Delays were expected. The road itself participated in scheduling. This had subtle effects on social life. Meetings required patience. Trade required contingency planning. Communication required allowances for uncertainty. The physical world inserted itself into human arrangements. A muddy road could influence decisions made many miles away. This interconnectedness becomes particularly striking when considering information networks. Messages moved at the speed of travelers. Official orders, commercial news, family correspondence, religious announcements, political developments. Everything traveled physically. Every message depended upon someone crossing real ground, and that ground was frequently muddy. The consequences could be significant. News might arrive days later than expected. Instructions could be delayed. Markets might operate on incomplete information. Communities adapted to these realities, but adaptation did not eliminate their effects. Distance felt different when every mile required effort. This brings us to an interesting reversal of perspective. For much of this documentary, we have examined mud as an obstacle. Yet from another angle, mud also served as a reminder of connection. A muddy road existed because people used it. Footprints indicated movement. Ruts indicated trade. Worn paths indicated community. The very features that frustrated travelers often revealed human activity. An untouched road was not necessarily desirable. A busy road, even a muddy one, suggested participation in wider networks. The road carried evidence of life. Horses had passed. Merchants had traveled. Neighbors had visited. Goods had moved. News had circulated. The mud preserved traces of all of it. In a curious way, medieval roads functioned like temporary records. Every footprint represented a journey. Every wheel track represented work. Every churned section represented interaction. Most of those stories disappeared quickly beneath new weather and new traffic. But for brief moments they remained visible. The ground remembered. A farmer heading toward market might see the tracks of a cart that left before dawn. A traveler approaching a village could estimate recent activity from the condition of the road. Signs of movement offered information. The landscape communicated. This constant dialogue between people and terrain shaped daily awareness in ways difficult for modern observers to fully appreciate. The ground was not passive. It responded. It recorded. It resisted. It guided behavior. And sometimes, during particularly difficult seasons, it reminded entire communities that even the simplest activities, walking, carrying, trading, visiting, working, depended upon a fragile balance between human effort and environmental conditions. That balance became especially visible during the long, wet winters that many medieval Europeans knew so well. When darkness arrived early, roads deteriorated steadily, and entire communities adjusted their routines to a world that seemed increasingly determined to turn every journey into a test of patience. That balance became especially visible during the long, wet winters that many medieval Europeans knew so well. When darkness arrived early, roads deteriorated steadily, and entire communities adjusted their routines to a world that seemed increasingly determined to turn every journey into a test of patience. Winter presents an interesting challenge for anyone trying to imagine medieval life. Modern people often picture snow. Medieval people often worried about what happened before the snow arrived, after it melted, or when it never arrived at all. The season that appears white in paintings was frequently brown beneath people's feet. Rain, sleet, thawing ice, saturated fields, overflowing ditches, and endlessly damp roads could create conditions every bit as troublesome as deep snowfall. In some regions, winter mud became a recurring fact of life. A traveler leaving a village before dawn might find the ground frozen hard beneath a layer of frost. The road appears manageable. Cart wheels roll smoothly. Footsteps sound crisp. By midday, the sun has softened the surface. By afternoon, frozen ruts become uneven channels of mud. The same road transforms within hours. This unpredictability required constant attention. One of the reasons medieval journeys often consumed more time than modern people expect is that conditions changed continuously. Distance was only one variable. Weather, daylight, terrain, and road quality all influenced travel speed. A route that could be completed comfortably in summer might become exhausting in winter. Yet life continued. This simple fact deserves emphasis. People still attended church. Markets still operated. Animals still needed care. Firewood still had to be gathered. Water still had to be carried. The practical obligations of life did not disappear simply because the roads became unpleasant. If anything, winter often increased the importance of movement. Fuel became more critical. Stored food required management. Livestock demanded attention. Communities relied heavily on preparation and planning. In this sense, muddy winter roads reveal something deeper about medieval resilience. The people living in these environments did not possess the option of withdrawing entirely from difficult conditions. Daily survival required participation. A peasant could not postpone feeding animals until spring. A miller could not stop grinding grain because the roads were unpleasant. A merchant might delay certain journeys, but economic activity rarely ceased altogether. Movement adapted rather than vanished. This adaptation often involved changing expectations. Winter travel tended to be slower. Loads might be reduced. Routes altered. Departure times adjusted. People worked with conditions rather than against them whenever possible. Such flexibility represented practical wisdom accumulated over generations. And wisdom mattered because mistakes could become costly. Consider something as simple as carrying water. Many medieval households depended upon wells, springs, rivers, or communal water sources. During favorable weather, obtaining water required effort but remained relatively straightforward. In winter, the same task became more complicated. Paths grew slippery. Containers became heavier in cold conditions. Repeated journeys wore down already difficult routes. A task performed every day suddenly demanded greater concentration. The challenge was not dramatic enough to appear in chronicles, yet it shaped daily experience. This is one of the recurring themes hidden within the history of mud. The most important consequences were often cumulative rather than spectacular. No single trip to the well defined a person's life. Thousands of trips did. The same principle applied to countless other activities. Fetching firewood, visiting neighbors, taking grain to a mill, attending church services, delivering goods, checking livestock. Each task seemed small in isolation. Together they formed the fabric of existence, and all of them unfolded upon roads, paths, and tracks whose condition changed with the seasons. The medieval year was therefore experienced physically. Modern calendars often divide time through dates, schedules, and obligations. Medieval communities frequently experienced time through environmental conditions. The feel of the road underfoot told people as much about the season as the date itself. The first deep mud of autumn signaled change. The frozen ground of winter signaled another. The thaw of spring announced yet another transition. Nature communicated directly through movement. This intimate relationship with seasonal change influenced social life as well. Gatherings often reflected practical realities. Travel became more difficult at certain times of year. Communities adjusted expectations accordingly. Visitors arrived less frequently during poor conditions. Journeys required greater planning. Distance felt longer, not because miles changed, but because effort changed. Effort is an important word here. The medieval experience of geography was largely an experience of effort. A modern road reduces effort. A muddy road increases it. The physical landscape acquired meaning through the energy required to cross it. This helps explain why relatively short distances could feel significant. A village 3 miles away might be easily accessible in one season and surprisingly inconvenient in another. The map remained identical. The experience did not. For medieval people, the practical landscape often mattered more than the theoretical one. What mattered was not merely where a place existed. What mattered was how difficult it was to reach. This distinction shaped economic relationships. Communities closer in distance were not always closer in practice. Road conditions influenced trade patterns. Markets competed partly through accessibility. Certain routes became preferred because they remained usable more consistently. Others gained reputations for difficulty. Over decades and centuries, these preferences could influence local development. Infrastructure quietly shaped history. Yet because infrastructure works in the background, its influence often escapes attention. People remember kings and battles. They forget drainage ditches. They remember castles. They forget road maintenance. And yet, without functioning routes, many famous events would have unfolded very differently. Even royal authority depended upon transportation. A king could issue commands. Those commands still needed to travel. Messengers rode roads. Officials crossed bridges. Documents moved through landscapes. Power itself required movement. This creates an interesting reversal. We often imagine power flowing downward from rulers toward ordinary people. In practical terms, power also flowed along roads. The condition of those roads mattered. A delayed messenger might alter decisions. A flooded crossing could slow administration. A damaged bridge could affect communication. Grand political systems ultimately rested upon ordinary physical realities. Mud connected to governance. Not directly, perhaps, but undeniably. The same was true of religion. Church attendance depended upon access. Pilgrimage depended upon routes. Monasteries relied upon transportation networks. Religious life unfolded within physical landscapes rather than outside them. Imagine a parish church on a rainy winter morning. The bell rings. People begin arriving. Some walk alone. Others travel in family groups. Their clothing carries traces of weather. Their shoes show evidence of the roads they crossed. The congregation gathering inside represents a small triumph over environmental inconvenience. Not because the journey was heroic, because it was repeated, week after week, year after year. The road became part of religious experience. Faith often required muddy shoes. This simple observation helps humanize the past. Medieval people were not abstractions living within historical systems. They were individuals navigating practical realities. They worried about weather. They noticed road conditions. They appreciated improvements. They complained about inconveniences. In many respects, their reactions were entirely recognizable. The difference lies primarily in scale. Modern infrastructure shields us from countless environmental challenges that remained visible in medieval life. When rain falls today, many people continue their routines with minimal disruption. Cars, pavement, drainage systems, waterproof materials, and engineered surfaces absorb much of the impact. Medieval communities possessed fewer buffers. Weather reached deeper into daily experience. The consequences became harder to ignore. This exposure shaped perception. A farmer noticed rainfall differently because crops depended upon it. A traveler noticed rainfall differently because roads depended upon it. A merchant noticed rainfall differently because profits depended upon it. Environmental awareness emerged naturally from necessity. People paid attention because attention mattered. In a curious way, mud encouraged observation. One learned to notice subtle variations. Which side of the road remained firmer? Where water collected? How quickly certain sections dried? Which routes tolerated heavy traffic? The landscape rewarded knowledge. A person who understood local conditions moved more efficiently. A stranger often learned through discomfort. This practical intelligence rarely appears in traditional histories because it was so commonplace. Yet it formed part of the expertise required for everyday life. The ability to read a road was a skill. The ability to judge weather was a skill. The ability to anticipate changing conditions was a skill. Entire communities possessed these abilities collectively. And perhaps that collective knowledge explains why medieval societies often functioned more effectively than modern stereotypes suggest. People adapted because adaptation was necessary. Not every adaptation succeeded. Not every problem could be solved. But countless small adjustments accumulated into workable systems. Roads deteriorated. Communities repaired them. Weather disrupted plans. People revised plans. Floods altered routes. Travelers found alternatives. Life proceeded through continuous negotiation. This pattern appears again and again throughout medieval history. Human effort meeting environmental reality. Neither side achieving complete victory. Both shaping outcomes. The road beneath one's feet became the most immediate expression of this relationship. It reflected weather, labor, technology, economics, geography, and community responsibility all at once. Few things were more ordinary. Few things reveal more. And nowhere did these relationships become more concentrated than around the medieval village itself, where nearly every aspect of daily existence, from farming and trade to social life and local identity, eventually converged upon the same muddy network of lanes, paths, field tracks, and communal spaces that connected neighbors to one another and connected the village to the wider world beyond its fields. And nowhere did these relationships become more concentrated than around the medieval village itself, where nearly every aspect of daily existence, from farming and trade to social life and local identity, eventually converged upon the same muddy network of lanes, paths, field tracks, and communal spaces that connected neighbors to one another and connected the village to the wider world beyond its fields. If we want to understand what it truly felt like to walk through mud every day in the Middle Ages, the village may be the best place to linger for a while. Not because villages were identical. They varied enormously across Europe. A settlement in England differed from one in France. A village in the Low Countries faced different environmental conditions than one in the hills of southern Germany. Geography, climate, agriculture, local customs, and wealth all influenced daily life. Yet despite these differences, many villages shared a common reality. Most movement happened on foot. This simple fact shaped everything. A modern person might spend only a few minutes each day walking outdoors. A medieval villager could spend hours moving between home, field, pasture, woodland, water source, church, workshop, or neighboring properties. The ground beneath their feet mattered because they encountered it constantly. Imagine waking before sunrise on an ordinary autumn morning. The fire has burned low during the night. The air inside the house feels cool. Outside, darkness still covers the village. Moisture hangs in the air. You step through the doorway. Immediately, the condition of the ground becomes relevant. A dry morning creates one set of possibilities. A muddy morning creates another. The difference affects how quickly work begins, how much effort it requires, and how comfortable the day will be. This constant awareness of footing is something modern people rarely experience. Most of us assume surfaces will cooperate. Medieval villagers often evaluated surfaces before every journey. The route to the fields might involve narrow tracks worn by generations of traffic. Some sections remained reasonably firm. Others collected water after rain. Certain areas became notorious for difficult footing. People remembered these locations. Children learned them. Visitors discovered them. The landscape developed a reputation. In some respects, roads and paths possessed personalities. Not officially, of course, but local people knew which stretches were troublesome and which could be trusted. A path that remained usable during wet weather became valuable knowledge. Knowledge of terrain functioned almost like a local language. Outsiders lacked fluency. Residents understood immediately. This practical expertise extended into agriculture itself. Many medieval fields were not isolated units connected by neat modern roads. Instead, agricultural landscapes often consisted of complex networks of strips, paths, boundaries, drainage channels, and access routes. Farmers moved through them continuously. Tools had to be carried. Animals had to be guided. Harvests had to be transported. Every agricultural activity involved movement, and movement meant contact with the ground. This relationship between farming and mud reveals an interesting irony. The very soil that supported life could also make life more difficult. Rain nourished crops. The same rain damaged roads. Productive land often generated transportation challenges. Success and inconvenience emerged from the same source. Medieval people understood this contradiction intimately. A wet season might promise healthy crops while simultaneously creating miserable travel conditions. A farmer could be grateful for rain and frustrated by mud at exactly the same time. Human beings have always possessed this ability to hold conflicting feelings. The medieval villager was no exception. In fact, daily life frequently required balancing competing realities. Good harvests demanded favorable weather. Favorable weather did not always produce comfortable roads. Comfort and necessity rarely aligned perfectly. The village itself reflected this tension. Many settlements developed around practical considerations such as access to water, arable land, grazing opportunities, and transportation routes. Yet those same advantages could create challenges. Water sources encouraged settlement but increased the risk of damp conditions. Productive agricultural land attracted activity but generated traffic. Animals provided wealth but contributed to the condition of roads and lanes. Everything connected. A single cow walking through a village lane may seem insignificant. Hundreds of cattle moving along the same route over months and years produced noticeable effects. Hooves compressed soil. Rain filled depressions. Wheels deepened ruts. The landscape evolved gradually beneath repeated use. This is one reason medieval roads often appear so organic in historical descriptions. They were shaped by behavior. People walked where walking made sense. Animals moved where movement was practical. Traffic patterns emerged through habit rather than abstract planning. The result was a landscape that reflected accumulated choices. Every path represented countless previous journeys. Every rut represented repeated use. Every muddy section told a story about how people interacted with their environment. There is something surprisingly intimate about this. Modern infrastructure often feels imposed from above. Roads appear according to plans. Highways cut across landscapes with remarkable authority. Medieval paths frequently emerged from repetition. They existed because people kept using them. In a very literal sense, communities walked roads into existence. And then those roads shaped the communities in return. This reciprocal relationship influenced social life more than we might expect. Consider the simple act of visiting a neighbor. Today, such a visit may involve crossing a clean sidewalk or driving a short distance. In a medieval village, weather conditions could influence the experience significantly. A visit during dry weather felt different from a visit during prolonged rain. The distance remained the same. The effort changed. Social interactions therefore occurred within environmental contexts. The village was not merely a collection of people. It was a collection of people navigating the same landscape. Shared challenges created shared experiences. Everyone knew which areas flooded. Everyone recognized difficult seasons. Everyone understood the inconvenience of certain routes. Common problems fostered common understanding. This perhaps helps explain why road maintenance often became a communal concern. Even when disagreements emerged over responsibilities, people recognized the importance of functioning routes. The inconvenience was shared. The benefits of improvement were shared as well. Not equally, of course, but widely enough to matter. The church provides an especially revealing example. In many villages, the church occupied a central physical and social position. It served religious functions, certainly, but it also acted as a gathering point, a landmark, and sometimes a place where information circulated. People needed to reach it, which meant access mattered. A muddy approach to the church affected attendance, movement, and daily experience. This may sound trivial, but it illustrates a larger point. Infrastructure influenced institutions. The condition of roads shaped how communities interacted with important places. The same principle applied to mills. For many medieval villagers, the mill was essential. Grain needed processing. Bread depended upon flour. Flour depended upon milling. People had to transport grain to the mill and carry flour away afterward. Road conditions affected the process. A muddy route increased effort. A damaged path slowed movement. The physical environment entered directly into economic life. The miller, perhaps more than many people, appreciated the importance of usable roads. Without movement, the system faltered, and systems mattered enormously in medieval villages. The village was not simply a collection of independent households. It functioned as an interconnected network of obligations, resources, and relationships. Fields connected to roads. Roads connected to markets. Markets connected to trade. Trade connected to wider regions. Every local journey participated in larger structures. This is why the history of mud becomes unexpectedly expansive. What begins as a story about dirty shoes gradually becomes a story about society itself. Mud influenced transportation. Transportation influenced commerce. Commerce influenced wealth. Wealth influenced infrastructure. Infrastructure influenced daily life. The chain extends outward in every direction. Yet despite these larger implications, it is important not to lose sight of individual experience. A medieval villager did not spend every moment contemplating transportation networks. They felt the immediate reality. The weight of wet shoes, the effort of pulling a cart, the discomfort of cold feet, the annoyance of a particularly difficult path. History sometimes becomes too abstract. Returning to physical sensations helps restore perspective. Imagine again that ordinary villager walking home near sunset. The day's labor is complete. The road remains muddy. Each step produces a familiar sound. The earth yields slightly beneath the foot. The air smells of damp soil, smoke, and livestock. Nothing dramatic is happening. No battle. No royal ceremony. No famous historical event. And yet this scene may be closer to the actual experience of medieval life than many grander images. Most people lived ordinary days. Most people walked ordinary roads. Most people encountered mud far more frequently than kings. The texture of history was often humble. That humility is part of what makes the subject so fascinating. Because once we begin paying attention to these details, entire worlds emerge. A muddy lane reveals patterns of movement. Patterns of movement reveal economic relationships. Economic relationships reveal social structures. Large historical questions become visible through small physical realities. Perhaps the most striking example of this appears in the contrast between expectation and reality. Modern culture frequently presents the Middle Ages through images of castles, tournaments, knights, and cathedrals. Those things certainly existed, but even the people associated with them still lived in landscapes shaped by weather and roads. The knight rode through mud. The merchant crossed muddy routes. The priest walked muddy paths. The laborer worked in muddy fields. Different social classes experienced these conditions differently, but none escaped them entirely. Mud was one of the great shared experiences of medieval life. Not equal in its effects, not identical in its burdens, but remarkably widespread. And because it was so widespread, people devoted considerable thought to minimizing its impact. They improved drainage. They raised walkways. They repaired roads. They modified footwear. They altered routes. They adapted constantly. The story is not one of passive suffering. It is a story of practical adjustment. Generation after generation, communities searched for ways to make daily life slightly easier. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes the weather undid their efforts. Then they tried again. This cycle repeated endlessly. Indeed, one of the most recognizable features of the medieval landscape was not any single road or building, but the evidence of continuous maintenance itself. Ditches being cleared, paths being reinforced, bridges being repaired, and villagers working together to preserve the fragile connections that allowed their community to function. And it is here, among those communal efforts to keep roads usable and movement possible, that we begin to see another side of the story. How the struggle against mud could bring entire communities together, turning an environmental problem into a shared responsibility that shaped village life in ways far deeper than most people would ever have noticed. And it is here, among those communal efforts to keep roads usable and movement possible, that we begin to see another side of the story. How the struggle against mud could bring entire communities together, turning an environmental problem into a shared responsibility that shaped village life in ways far deeper than most people would ever have noticed. There is a temptation, when looking back at the Middle Ages, to search for the extraordinary. We look for kings and queens, great battles, magnificent cathedrals, legendary journeys, dramatic turning points. Yet after spending so much time on these muddy roads, another truth begins to emerge. Most medieval people experienced history through ordinary things. The road to the well, the walk to church, the journey to market, the path between neighboring fields, the muddy lane outside the front door. These were the stages upon which daily life unfolded. And daily life, more than any single event, shaped how people understood the world. The villagers repairing a damaged road after heavy rain were not thinking about how future historians might interpret their efforts. They were trying to ensure that grain could reach the mill, that neighbors could visit one another, that livestock could be moved safely, and that life could continue with slightly fewer obstacles. In that sense, mud teaches us something unexpectedly important about the medieval world. It reminds us that history is not only made by dramatic events. History is also made by maintenance, by repetition, by persistence, by countless acts of practical problem-solving that rarely appear in chronicles but quietly sustain entire societies. The more closely we examine medieval roads, the harder it becomes to view the period through simple stereotypes. The Middle Ages were neither a golden age of picturesque simplicity nor a nightmare of endless misery. They were a complex human world filled with adaptation, compromise, ingenuity, frustration, and resilience. People complained about mud. They also learned how to live with it. They developed techniques, habits, technologies, and community practices that allowed daily life to function despite difficult conditions. What initially appears as a story about dirty roads gradually reveals itself as a story about human beings responding to their environment. Again and again, year after year, generation after generation. And perhaps that is why the subject feels strangely familiar. The details differ from our own lives, but the underlying experience is recognizable. People confronted problems they did not choose. They worked around limitations. They relied on neighbors. They improved what they could. They endured what they could not. They adapted. That rhythm is timeless. If a modern visitor could stand quietly beside a medieval village lane on a wet autumn evening, they might first notice the mud, the ruts, the puddles, the damp air, the worn shoes. But if they stayed a little longer, they might notice something else. A farmer helping another free a stuck cart. Children confidently navigating paths they know by heart. Neighbors exchanging news while walking home. A traveler receiving advice about the road ahead. A community functioning through cooperation, experience, and shared understanding. The mud remains, yet so does everything built in response to it. And that may be the deeper lesson hidden beneath all those footprints. The medieval world was not remarkable because people walked through mud every day. It was remarkable because they built lives, communities, economies, and cultures while doing so. The roads were difficult. The journeys were often uncomfortable. The weather frequently imposed its will. And still people traveled. Still they traded. Still they worshipped. Still they raised families. Still they repaired roads, rebuilt bridges, planted crops, attended markets, and planned for the future. Life continued. The muddy road was never the whole story. It was simply the ground upon which the story took place. Modern culture frequently presents the Middle Ages through images of castles, tournaments, knights, and cathedrals. Those things certainly existed, but even the people associated with them still lived in landscapes shaped by weather and roads. The knight rode through mud. The merchant crossed muddy routes. The priest walked muddy paths. The laborer worked in muddy fields. Different social classes experienced these conditions differently, but none escaped them entirely. Mud was one of the great shared experiences of medieval life. Not equal in its effects, not identical in its burdens, but remarkably widespread. And because it was so widespread, people devoted considerable thought to minimizing its impact. They improved drainage. They raised walkways. They repaired roads. They modified footwear. They altered routes. They adapted constantly. The story is not one of passive suffering. It is a story of practical adjustment. Generation after generation, communities searched for ways to make daily life slightly easier. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes the weather undid their efforts. Then they tried again. This cycle repeated endlessly. Indeed, one of the most recognizable features of the medieval landscape was not any single road or building, but the evidence of continuous maintenance itself. Ditches being cleared, paths being reinforced, bridges being repaired, and villagers working together to preserve the fragile connections that allowed their community to function. And it is here, among those communal efforts to keep roads usable and movement possible, that we begin to see another side of the story. How the struggle against mud could bring entire communities together, turning an environmental problem into a shared responsibility that shaped village life in ways far deeper than most people would ever have noticed. And it is here, among those communal efforts to keep roads usable and movement possible, that we begin to see another side of the story. How the struggle against mud could bring entire communities together, turning an environmental problem into a shared responsibility that shaped village life in ways far deeper than most people would ever have noticed. There is a temptation, when looking back at the Middle Ages, to search for the extraordinary. We look for kings and queens, great battles, magnificent cathedrals, legendary journeys, dramatic turning points. Yet after spending so much time on these muddy roads, another truth begins to emerge. Most medieval people experienced history through ordinary things. The road to the well, the walk to church, the journey to market, the path between neighboring fields, the muddy lane outside the front door. These were the stages upon which daily life unfolded. And daily life, more than any single event, shaped how people understood the world. The villagers repairing a damaged road after heavy rain were not thinking about how future historians might interpret their efforts. They were trying to ensure that grain could reach the mill, that neighbors could visit one another, that livestock could be moved safely, and that life could continue with slightly fewer obstacles. In that sense, mud teaches us something unexpectedly important about the medieval world. It reminds us that history is not only made by dramatic events. History is also made by maintenance, by repetition, by persistence, by countless acts of practical problem-solving that rarely appear in chronicles but quietly sustain entire societies. The more closely we examine medieval roads, the harder it becomes to view the period through simple stereotypes. The Middle Ages were neither a golden age of picturesque simplicity nor a nightmare of endless misery. They were a complex human world filled with adaptation, compromise, ingenuity, frustration, and resilience. People complained about mud. They also learned how to live with it. They developed techniques, habits, technologies, and community practices that allowed daily life to function despite difficult conditions. What initially appears as a story about dirty roads gradually reveals itself as a story about human beings responding to their environment. Again and again, year after year, generation after generation, And perhaps that is why the subject feels strangely familiar. The details differ from our own lives, but the underlying experience is recognizable. People confronted problems they did not choose. They worked around limitations. They relied on neighbors. They improved what they could. They endured what they could not. They adapted. That rhythm is timeless. If a modern visitor could stand quietly beside a medieval village lane on a wet autumn evening, they might first notice the mud, the ruts, the puddles, the damp air, the worn shoes. But if they stayed a little longer, they might notice something else. A farmer helping another free a stuck cart. Children confidently navigating paths they know by heart. Neighbors exchanging news while walking home. A traveler receiving advice about the road ahead. A community functioning through cooperation, experience, and shared understanding. The mud remains, yet so does everything built in response to it. And that may be the deeper lesson hidden beneath all those footprints. The medieval world was not remarkable because people walked through mud every day. It was remarkable because they built lives, communities, economies, and cultures while doing so. The roads were difficult. The journeys were often uncomfortable. The weather frequently imposed its will. And still people traveled. Still they traded. Still they worshipped. Still they raised families. Still they repaired roads, rebuilt bridges, planted crops, attended markets, and planned for the future. Life continued. The muddy road was never the whole story. It was simply the ground upon which the story took place.